Most weight loss plans are one size fits all, not taking into account each person's individual needs. Noom is here to change that. Noom Weight uses psychology. That's why they say losing weight starts with your brain. But it also takes into account your unique biological factors, which also affect weight loss success. The program helps you understand the science behind your eating choices and why you have cravings. Everyone's journey is different, so your daily lessons are personalized to you and your goals. One of the great things about Noom is that it's nourishing instead of restrictive. They focus on progress instead of perfection. You don't have to give up carbs, or anything for that matter. Have cravings? Food FOMO? Noom can help you lose weight while still enjoying your favorite foods. To date, Noom has helped more than 5.2 million people lose weight. Stay focused on what's important to you with Noom's psychology and biology-based approach. Sign up for your trial today at Noom.com. That's Noom.com.
Hi, everyone. It's Cam and Jen from Our True Crime Podcast. We've been best friends for over 40 years, and we've been putting out our podcast every Wednesday afternoon for the past 6 years.
Every week, we take you through each case, backed by meticulous research and delivered with absolute respect for the victims and the lives that they impacted.
When you listen, you're really going to feel like you're right at the table, joining in the conversation with us, your witty, lifelong friends.
I mean, after all, this isn't just any true crime podcast. It's our true crime podcast. Be sure to follow Our True Crime Podcast on your favorite podcast app today.
You know those moments where you think, wow, someone should really step in and help this guy? Well, welcome to the life of Richard Chase, a man who went from blaming his mom for controlling his mind to, let's just say, developing a very personal relationship with the neighborhood rabbit population. Diagnosed with severe mental illness but consistently ignored, his spiral was a full-on crash, and everyone around him just kept handing him the keys. This is a story of a man whose untreated delusions turned gruesome and left a permanent stain on Sacramento. From the bizarre to the downright horrifying, this episode's going to leave you wondering how many red flags could possibly go unnoticed or just flat out ignored. But before we get into that story, if you like your true crime brief and bingeable, you have found the right podcast. Hit the follow button now for access to at least 2 episodes per week. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder. When it comes to true crime, some cases read like poorly thought out fiction, implausible, grotesque, and baffling. Then there's Richard Chase, whose life was a parade of warning signs ignored until the catastrophic crescendo. Chase wasn't so much born into chaos as he was marinated in it. Every aspect of his life seemed to scream for intervention, but no one picked up the phone. Born in 1950 in Sacramento, California, Richard Chase arrived as an unplanned stress test for a marriage already teetering on the brink. His parents weren't exactly relationship goals. Their arguments made the Hatfields and McCoys look like diplomats. Richard's mother, a master class in paranoia, regularly accused her husband of poisoning her. Why? So he could supposedly have his way with her while she slept. A claim as baseless as it was disturbing. The accusations didn't stop there. According to her, there was also a secret mistress involved, one so dedicated to skulking that she supposedly hid in the bushes during a family trip. No one else ever saw this phantom bush lady, but the allegation stuck around like a bad house guest. By the time Richard was a teenager, all that parental toxicity had soaked straight into his DNA. He was a walking testament to unresolved trauma, channeling his angst into drugs, likely to numb the festering unease that his childhood left behind. Unfortunately, those substances didn't just dull the edges, they fueled the particular behaviors that would become part of his calling card. It's safe to say Richard's early years were a disaster, unfolding in slow motion, setting the stage for the chilling chapters to come. Richard Chase's behavior often left people scratching their heads. One of his stranger habits, falling asleep naked in the family room, heaters cranked to full blast while every window in the house was wide open. Was it a rebellion against a chaotic upbringing or an early glimpse of something far more troubling? Hindsight makes the answer unsettlingly clear. Despite his oddities, Richard managed to maintain a surface-level normalcy, popular, well-dressed, seemingly composed. But beneath that polished exterior brewed a storm of dread and anxiety. One he couldn't suppress once he got a girlfriend. The relationship unraveled when she revealed that his impotence was the breaking point. The breakup marked the start of Richard's downward spiral. Hygiene became the first casualty. He stopped bathing. He let his hair grow out, and he neglected himself completely. Though he graduated high school with solid grades, his college experience was a disaster. Poor attendance and failing results pushed him to drop out. Then came the supposed symptoms. Richard claimed his heart would sometimes stop beating. Medical tests found nothing physically wrong, but no amount of evidence could sway him. He was convinced that something inside him was catastrophically broken. What began as a vague complaint quickly became a cornerstone of Richard's increasingly fractured reality. The first in a series of delusions that would define and ultimately destroy his life. Richard Chase's heart wasn't just metaphorically broken. He became convinced it was physically falling apart. His delusions escalated quickly. First, he believed that someone had stolen his pulmonary artery. It's very specific. Then he became convinced that his bones and his skull had detached and were rattling around in his head. As his mind unraveled, his body followed. Richard grew painfully thin and jittery, a result of heavy drug use and bizarre behavior. Holding down a job became impossible, and one horrifying incident at home got him kicked out for good. Believing his heart was shrinking and his blood had turned into dust, Richard killed the family dog and drank its blood in a desperate attempt to heal himself. He soon found a new living arrangement in the strangest way. Loitering in the yard of two strangers, Sid DeMarchi and Rachel Statham. After what must have been a pretty surreal conversation, they agreed to let him move in. His parents even chipped in $50 a month for rent. But Richard's habits made him the roommate from hell. He often wandered around the house naked and intoxicated, barricaded himself in his room, and even nailed his wardrobe shut to keep intruders out. Sid and Rachel quickly left, passing their rooms to Rachel's brother and his friends. They didn't last long either. Richard's behavior drove them out too. Left alone, Richard couldn't afford the rent, and his delusions only grew darker as his isolation deepened. After years of erratic behavior and paranoia, Richard ended up where many troubled adults reluctantly returned, his parents' house. But things there were anything but stable. His parents had recently divorced, and Richard's delusions escalated. Living alone with his mother, he became convinced that she was poisoning him and moved in with his father instead. That didn't work out either. His behavior became too much for his father, leading Richard to bounce between households, leaving both parents drained and desperate. The breaking point came in 1972. During an argument, Richard's mother called the police, but while on the phone, he attacked her, hitting her over the head with the phone receiver. In a baffling move, she did not press charges, but the incident permanently barred Richard from her home. He moved to Los Angeles to live with his grandmother, but his unraveling continued. She often heard him muttering to himself, carrying on conversations with absolutely no one. One night, she walked into his room to find him standing on his head. Richard calmly explained it was his way of getting blood to flow back into his brain, a homemade fix for a problem no doctor had ever diagnosed. As Richard became thinner, more disheveled, and increasingly erratic, his obsessions grew darker. His fascination with human anatomy turned into a gruesome hobby, cutting out pictures of organs from medical books and pinning them to his walls. His paranoia also became harder to ignore. Once he called an ambulance, claiming severe heart pain. Doctors found nothing wrong with him physically, but the untreated mental illness was becoming impossible to miss, except, it seemed, by his family. When Richard Chase was finally evaluated by medical professionals, the diagnosis was blunt. He suffered from a psychiatric disturbance of major proportion. That's a quote. But his parents weren't convinced. Instead of pursuing the necessary treatment, they dismissed the diagnosis and brought him back home, a decision with dire consequences. Richard's behavior did what it had always done, escalated. One evening, while watching television, he saw a program about a cat receiving medical treatment. To Richard, even a cat was being treated better than he ever had. Enraged, he took the family cat outside. His mother heard a gunshot and ran to find him covered in blood, tearing apart the cat's remains and smearing them all over his body. This horrifying act led to another hospital admission, where Richard was diagnosed with acute paranoid schizophrenia, a condition requiring intensive care. But once again, his mother intervened. Convinced she knew better than the doctors, she removed Richard from their care and brought him home with her. She later claimed that he had fully recovered under her supervision, a claim that would tragically be proven false. To Richard Chase's father, his son's relationship with his mother was a constant war. Richard believed she controlled his mind, and their arguments often turned physical. After each fight, she'd call his father for help, but these interventions only worsened Richard's anger. Desperate, his parents set him up with his own apartment, hoping for stability. His father visited regularly until one day he found Richard barely alive on the floor. Richard had been injecting rabbit blood into his veins, a twisted attempt to cure his delusion that his heart was shrinking and his blood had turned into powder. Admitted to a psychiatric hospital, Richard insisted fresh blood was his only cure. Despite his erratic behaviors, doctors released him into his mother's care again. She began weaning him off his medication, and any progress unraveled as his untreated psychosis dragged him deeper into violence and delusion. He began purchasing puppies and small pets through classified ads, killing them in gruesome rituals. Whether this was delusional compulsion or practice for something worse remains unclear. Richard also obtained a gun, amplifying the danger. Neighbors frequently reported hearing gunshots from his apartment, sometimes aimed at the animals he consumed, other times at the voices in his head. On December 29, 1977, Richard turned his violence outward. Denied the chance to spend the holidays at his mother's house because his sister feared him, Richard lashed out. He spotted 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin unloading groceries in his driveway and killed him in a senseless drive-by shooting. Less than a month later, on January 23, 1978, Richard broke into the home of Teresa Wallen, shooting her 3 times. He mutilated her body, repeatedly stabbing her stomach, sexually assaulting her, and removing her organs. Teresa tragically was alive for much of this and 3 months pregnant at the time of her murder. 4 days later, Richard escalated further, breaking into the home of Evelyn Maroth, killing her 6-year-old son Jason, her 22-month-old nephew David, and her friend Dan Meredith. After killing them, he mutilated Evelyn's body, sexually assaulted her remains, and did the same to little David before fleeing with David's remains in his car. The aftermath mirrored the brutality seen at Teresa Wallen's house. Neighbors reported a disheveled man in an orange ski parka near both crime scenes. When the police released a composite sketch, a high school acquaintance of Richard came forward, recalling seeing him wearing the distinctive jacket. When police entered his apartment, they found a blood-soaked scene, with David's remains in a box in the trash. "I was sick," Richard later told psychiatrists. "I was trying to get free of Poison Place and go live with my grandmother's relatives." Richard was arrested and admitted to a mental facility while the courts debated whether he was competent to stand trial. Ultimately, he was convicted and sentenced to death, but Richard would not live long enough to face execution. On December 26, 1980, he was found dead in his cell after overdosing on antidepressant medication he'd been stockpiling. Beside him lay a 4-page note, part of it written in code, and the rest revealing his final delusion. He believed taking his own life was the only way to stop his heart from beating for good. Richard Chase's short, horrifying reign of terror was over, but his story remains a chilling reminder of what can happen when untreated mental illness, delusion, and violence collide. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe. I'm the host. Thank you for joining today, especially if you're a new listener. If you've just joined the podcast, I hope that you enjoyed this episode. And let me tell you, it could have been, if you don't know this story, this Richard Chase story, The Vampire of Sacramento is what he's called. It could have been a lot worse. I intentionally don't put in a bunch of the gross details. This one had a bunch. And if you think this was bad, you should see what I left on the cutting room floor, so to speak. It's real bad, like nightmare bad. But anyway, if you're a new listener, make sure you hit subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts and in all of those places. I've mentioned this before. If you listen to podcasts on 2, 3, 4 listening apps, subscribe on all of those just in case you happen to be in one of those and you want to listen to the podcast. It's going to be right there. The websites, you can go to that. It's got all the information about the podcast, all the links to all the places, and a blog. A blog is there as well. And I know I mentioned it and then shut up about it, but I'm going to mention it again. I will be doing eventually a newsletter. I'll send out a newsletter eventually, and you can go to the website and sign up for that newsletter, 10minutemurder.com. If you want to send me an email, you can do that, joe@10minutemurder.com. And that's going to do it. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast.